Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you are watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. I had been living alone in that tiny one-bedroom apartment off Packard Street for only a few months, but I already knew the building had a strange kind of silence to it at night. The walls were thin, yet somehow the place always felt muffled, like every sound was being held back. Early October made it worse. The cold had started to slide in through the loose window frames, and even the heater made this low humming sound that seemed to vibrate through the floor. It was comforting sometimes, but other times it made me too aware of how quiet everything else was. That night, I'd fallen asleep on the couch with the TV on low. I had meant to watch something light before bed, just to take the edge off the long day. But I must have drifted off sometime around midnight. When I opened my eyes again, the screen was just a soft gray glow, and the only real light came from the cable box clock. 1:42 a.m. The room was cold enough that I could feel the chill on my face before I even sat up. I was still half asleep when I heard the first sound. At first it didn't register as anything important, just something soft like a shuffle. I blinked and listened harder. The TV was still making a faint background noise, so I reached for the remote and muted it. The sudden silence felt sharper, and that was when I heard it clearly slow footsteps in the hallway just outside my apartment door. They weren't normal footsteps. They were too light and too spaced out, as if someone was trying not to be heard. My hallway was small, only a few doors on each side, and it had that thin industrial carpet that didn't do much to hide noise. I could hear the shift of weight in each step, the slight drag of a shoe brushing against the fibers. Someone was right outside my door, and they weren't walking past. They were moving with intention. I stayed completely still, listening. The steps got closer, only a few feet now. Then they stopped, right outside my apartment. I didn't move at all. I felt my heartbeat start to pick up fast, loud enough that I wondered if I was imagining it echoing in my ears. I stared at the dark shape of the door from the couch, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. A minute passed, then another. I almost convinced myself I had imagined it, but then I heard the door handle, a soft metal rattle. Slow, careful, like someone testing the lock to see if it would turn. Not shaking it hard, just easing it down and letting it rise again. I felt a cold wave go over me. I didn't have anything in that apartment that counted as protection. The closest thing was a wine bottle sitting upside down in the drying rack. I didn't even want to move, but I forced myself to slide slowly off the couch and crouch behind the half wall separating the kitchen from the living room. My knees made the smallest sound against the floor, and I froze as if the person outside could hear that through the door. The handle stopped moving. Silence again, but a different kind. A waiting kind. I stayed crouched there in the dark, barely breathing. The air felt heavy, like the whole apartment was holding its breath with me. Then I heard it. A whisper. A low man's voice right on the other side of the door. I couldn't make out a single word. It wasn't loud, but it was close enough that there was no way it was coming from anywhere else. It was meant for the door. Meant for the space behind it. Something in me started to shake. My hands felt weak, but I forced myself to reach for my phone on the floor near the couch. When I finally got it, I dialed 911 with fingers that didn't want to cooperate. I didn't move from my spot behind the wall. I just crouched there and listened to that faint whispering sound while waiting for someone to answer. Every second felt stretched and thin. When the operator picked up, I kept my voice low and tried not to make any noise that could travel to the hall. At some point while I was talking to them, the whispering stopped. I hadn't heard any footsteps walking away. There had been no sound of retreat at all. But when the operator told me the officers were close and that I should stay where I was, I realized I didn't hear anything at all outside the door anymore. The police said it would take around 10 minutes. It took 12. Those 12 minutes felt like an hour. I kept expecting the handle to turn again. I kept imagining a shadow appearing below the gap at the bottom of the door. Every time the building made a normal settling noise, I tensed up, waiting for something worse. When the officers finally knocked on my door, I didn't move right away. I made them speak again before I went to unlock it. My hands were still unsteady when I opened the door for them. They checked the hallway first, walking up and down the length of it. Nothing. Nobody. The air was cold out there too. Colder than it should have been inside a building. But that might have just been my nerves. Then one of them looked down. There was something under my doormat. A single folded piece of printer paper. My name written on the outside in blocky letters. Just my name. The officers unfolded it carefully, but the inside was blank. Not a mark, not even an indentation. Just a clean sheet of paper that had only been used long enough to write my name on the front. They searched the hallway again, checked the stairwell, even looked outside around the parking lot. Nothing. No one saw anything. No cameras in that building either. The officers asked me some questions, wrote up a report, and stayed for a little while to make sure I felt safe enough to be alone again. I told them I'd be fine, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat awake on the couch with every light on, listening for any sound in the hallway. The apartment felt different, not like a place I lived in, but like a place someone had managed to reach into from the outside. The next morning, everything looked normal again, but normal didn't feel right. I kept replaying the sound of those soft footsteps in my head, the slow testing of the handle, the whisper too close to ignore. I didn't know who that person was, or how long they had been standing out there before I woke up. I didn't know if they lived in the building, or if they had followed me home earlier that day without me noticing. The only thing I knew for certain was that they had known my name. I lasted less than 2 weeks after that. Every night felt like waiting for something to happen again. Every small noise in the hallway made my stomach tighten. I couldn't relax in that apartment anymore. I didn't feel safe walking into it or locking the door behind me. The never found face behind that whisper stuck with me every time I tried to sleep. I packed everything I owned into boxes and moved out. I didn't care that the lease wasn't over. I paid the fee to break it without arguing. I just wanted distance between me and that door, between me and the hallway, where someone had stood in the middle of the night, whispering things meant only for me to hear, leaving my name under the mat like they were reminding me they knew exactly who was inside. I never found out who it was. No one did. And even though nothing else ever happened, that night stayed with me long after I left. Sometimes I still wake up at random hours, thinking I hear soft footsteps outside my door. It's never real now, but I always listen anyway, just to be sure. And I never sleep with the TV muted anymore. I wasn't a parent, not even close. I was just doing a favor for my sister, because she and her husband wanted one night away in Santa Fe. Their place was on the east side of Albuquerque, a small beige stucco house tucked into a quiet neighborhood where the streetlights always looked a little too dim, and the sidewalks always felt a little too empty at night. I'd stayed there before, but never alone and never overnight. I told myself it didn't matter. It was just one night. Their baby girl's room had one of those Wi-Fi monitors, small white camera, little green LED, live audio feed app on the phone. I had access to the app because my sister insisted it would help me feel safer. I didn't need to feel safer. The baby wasn't even there. They had taken her with them. But I kept the monitor running anyway, mostly because I didn't want to mess with anything they usually had set up. The house was quiet in that thick way that makes every little sound feel louder. The fridge hummed off and on. The heater clicked when it decided to run. Cars passed once in a while, but most of the time the place felt completely still. Outside, the temperature had dropped fast after sunset. Albuquerque nights in early fall always had that cold bite that settled under your skin. Around 11:56 p.m., I was in the living room scrolling through my phone, watching some old rerun muted on the TV. The monitor app was open in a small window in the corner of my screen, just sitting there showing the baby's empty crib. I wasn't paying much attention to it until I heard a soft click. Not from the house, from the app. It was the sound the monitor made when it adjusted its camera. I looked down. The crib was empty, which wasn't strange at first. My niece slept with her parents most nights. But then I saw the camera shift slightly to the right, very slow. very smooth, like it was following something by itself. My stomach tightened. I waited for some explanation to pop into my head. Maybe the house shifted. Maybe the app glitched. Maybe I accidentally swiped something. I checked the controls. Nothing was pressed. My hands weren't even near the screen. Then the monitor beeped, the soft, high-pitched tone that meant it had detected movement. The little motion icon flashed red. But nothing in the room was moving. The crib was still. The curtains weren't swaying. Not even a shadow shifted. I didn't know what else to do, so I tapped the mic button. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to see if the audio was lagging or if the mic was stuck. I said a small, quiet hello, barely more than a breath. Right after that, the camera jerked, not a gentle pan this time, but a sharp snap toward the door of the room. It stopped there, perfectly still, pointed straight at the doorway like something had moved through it. I felt the air leave my lungs in one long, slow exhale. My heart thudded in a way that felt too heavy, like each beat echoed through my whole chest. I kept staring at the screen, waiting for something else to shift or glitch or give me a normal reason for what I saw. Nothing did. I got up from the couch in one quick motion and walked down the hallway. Each step felt too loud. The carpet felt thicker than usual under my feet. The hallway was narrow and dark. I flipped the light on near the baby's room, and the brightness made me squint. I pushed the door open. The room looked exactly how it usually looked. White crib, pale pink blanket, a small bookshelf, a mobile with wooden clouds. Everything neat, everything still. No sound, no movement, no person. But then I saw the carpet near the crib. Right beside the crib, maybe a foot away from the rail, the carpet was marked by a set of muddy footprints. Not tiny footprints like a child might leave. These were small but still adult-sized, like someone with narrow feet had stood there. The mud looked fresh, dark, damp, smudged along the fibers. Whoever made them had walked straight up to the crib, then stepped backward toward the corner of the room. My throat tightened. The house was sealed. I had checked the doors earlier. The windows were locked. The security latch on the back door was still in place. The front door had both deadbolts on. My sister kept the house locked like a habit. I crouched down and touched the edge of one footprint. It was slightly wet. Real mud, not dust, not a stain, not something old. My hand shook when I pulled it back. I checked the closet first. Nothing but boxes of baby clothes. I pulled everything out anyway, pushing aside folded blankets, old diapers, toys still in their packages. Nothing. I lowered myself and checked under the crib. Nothing but a zipped storage bag with extra sheets. I opened it anyway, just sheets. I checked behind the dresser, moved the glider chair, opened the drawers, empty. Everything exactly as it should be, except for the footprints. That's when the feeling hit me. The heavy, solid certainty that someone had been inside that room not long before I walked in. I went through the entire house. I opened the hall closet, turned on every light, looked behind every piece of furniture. I checked the back door again, still locked from the inside. I checked the windows, all latched. I checked under the kitchen sink, behind the shower curtain, in the laundry room, in the garage. Nothing was disturbed. Everything was normal, except for those prints. I finally called the police. My voice felt flat when I explained what I saw. They were polite, but I could tell from their tone that they were expecting to find a misunderstanding. One officer walked through the house with a flashlight. One checked the windows from the outside. They asked if I might have stepped in something and tracked it in without noticing. They asked if the prints could have come from earlier. They asked if my sister had done some yard work earlier that day. I kept saying no. When they went into the baby's room, one of them crouched and touched the carpet like I did. He said the mud felt slightly cool. Not warm, not room temperature, cool like it came from outside. But there was no mud anywhere else in the house. No trail, no faint prints, nothing. Just that small cluster beside the crib. They walked the perimeter of the house with their flashlights. No signs of forced entry. No disturbed soil near the windows. The backyard gate was latched. The officer said, maybe the footprints were old and I hadn't noticed them before. I knew that wasn't true because I had walked into that room earlier in the evening just to check the window, and the carpet had been clean. After an hour, they told me there was nothing they could do except file a report in case something else happened later. They said the house was safe. Then they left. I locked the doors again. I checked the windows again. I sat on the living room couch with every light on in the house and waited for morning. I didn't sleep. I didn't even close my eyes. Every small sound made my skin tighten. When my sister came back the next day, I didn't tell her everything. I said the monitor glitched and the police came because I thought someone tried to break in. She already looked stressed, and I didn't want her thinking something dangerous had happened inside the room where her baby usually slept. She replaced the monitor that same afternoon. She still doesn't know what I really saw. I never told her about the footprints or how cold they felt or how the camera followed something invisible in that room. I never told her how long I sat awake after the police left, convinced someone had walked inside the house and stood there in the dark, while I was only a few rooms away. When I drove home later that day, I kept thinking about the locked doors, the sealed windows, the clean floors everywhere except that one patch of carpet beside the crib. The prints weren't from me. They weren't from her. They weren't from the police. But they came from someone. Someone who stood quietly in that room, close to the crib, long enough to leave wet mud behind and not a single sign of how they got in or out. That part still sits in my mind the worst. Not the camera moving, not the empty room, not the silence. The worst part was how clean the rest of the house was. Whoever stepped into that room came in without leaving a trace and left the same way. Quiet, careful, and fast enough that even the police couldn't figure out how. And that's the part I can't explain even to myself. I was living in Halifax in a rental townhouse off Herring Cove Road, one of those narrow places with creaky floors, and a basement that always smelled a little damp. No matter how often I aired it out, it wasn't haunted or anything like that, just old, poorly maintained, and probably patched together by a landlord who hired the cheapest help he could find. The basement light switch had been strange since the day I moved in. Sometimes the light flickered when the washing machine shook during its spin cycle. Other times it stayed steady. I never trusted it, but laundry meant I had to go down there anyway. It was a rainy Wednesday night around 3 p.m., the kind of cold, steady maritime rain that rattles against windows and settles into your bones. I had been putting off laundry for a week and finally forced myself to carry the basket downstairs. The air felt colder than usual, like the humidity was sitting heavy in the stairwell. When I reached the bottom, the light overhead flickered once and then settled into that weak yellow glow it always had. I loaded the washer, shut the lid, and as soon as it kicked into its first cycle, the basement light went out completely. Not a flicker, not a dimming, just darkness. For a second I thought maybe the power had gone out in the whole place, but upstairs the TV was still on and the fridge humming. I cursed under my breath, annoyed, and ready to head right back upstairs. But I needed the laundry done. I reached for my phone, turned on the flashlight, and aimed the weak white beam around. The shadows looked sharp and deep in the narrow room. The furnace sat in its usual corner, metal sides dull with dust, and the washing machine rattled softly beside me. That was when I heard it. Not movement, not a footstep or a shuffle or anything you could shrug off as the house settling. It was breathing. Slow, steady, controlled. Almost like someone trying not to breathe too loudly. The kind of sound you only notice when everything else goes still. It came from behind the furnace. I froze with my phone held out in front of me, the light shaking in my hand, trying to convince myself it was just the pipes or the furnace making some weird sound. But furnaces don't breathe like that. And this wasn't mechanical. It was too human. The worst part was how calm it sounded. Like whoever was down there wasn't surprised. Like they were waiting. I didn't move at first. My chest felt tight, and I could hear my own pulse too loud in my ears. I tried to breathe as quietly as possible. The basement suddenly felt too small, too close, like the walls had crept in around me. I took one single step backward, keeping the light pointed at the furnace. The breathing didn't stop. It didn't speed up. It didn't change at all. It was like the person didn't even care that I was there. When I reached the bottom step of the stairs, the wood creaked. The breathing stopped instantly, completely silent. The kind of silence that feels sharp, like something holding its breath, listening. I didn't wait. I didn't test the light or look around or do anything except move as fast and quiet as I could. I climbed the stairs, my hand tight on the railing, and when I reached the top, I slammed the door shut with more force than I intended. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. I didn't try to be brave. I didn't go back down or investigate. I walked straight to the living room, locked the basement door, then called 911. I felt stupid explaining it to the operator. I heard breathing in my basement, but she told me to stay upstairs and wait for the officers. They arrived fast, considering the weather. 2 of them went downstairs while I stood near the kitchen, arms crossed tight over my chest, trying to stop imagining someone crouched in the dark behind that furnace, waiting for me to come back. The officers searched everything. They checked the windows, the furnace corner, the back storage room, even the crawl space that I avoided because it smelled like wet rust. They took their time. When they came back up, they told me they found nothing. No signs of forced entry. No footprints, no open windows, nothing out of place. They said maybe the sound came from the furnace. Maybe I was nervous because the basement was dark. Maybe the storm made the house echo. I nodded even though I knew it wasn't true. Breathing is breathing. I know what I heard. After they left, I locked the basement door again and shoved a chair under the handle. I barely slept. Every time the rain hit the windows in a heavy gust, I jolted awake thinking someone was moving downstairs. The washing machine finished its cycle sometime in the night, but I didn't go down to get the clothes. I could buy new clothes before I went back down there. The next morning, I had to leave for work early. I didn't want to open the basement door, but something in me felt like I had to look, like I needed to know if the police really hadn't missed anything. I pushed the chair aside and turned the doorknob slowly, half expecting resistance from the other side. The door opened quietly. The basement light was on somehow. I hadn't turned it back on. I hadn't even been able to. It glowed steady now, like nothing had ever been wrong with it. The light reached the stairs just enough for me to see the bottom step. That was when I saw them. 2 muddy boot prints. One on the bottom step, the second on the floor just beyond it. They led from the stairs toward the furnace. The mud looked fresh, like whoever made them had walked through wet ground, not long before stepping into my basement. The prints ended behind the furnace. There were no prints leading back out. No trail going anywhere else. Just 2 prints going in, none coming out. I stared at them for a long time, long enough for my skin to crawl and my stomach twist. The rain had been heavy all night. The kind of weather that leaves deep mud in the yard. I knew those prints weren't mine. I hadn't been outside since getting home from work the day before. The officers had worn clean boots. They left no marks at all. And no one else had any reason to be in that house. The only thing I could think was that someone had come in somehow, hidden behind the furnace, and stayed there until I left. They stayed still enough for the officers to miss them. Stayed quiet enough to blend into the house. And when the time was right, they slipped out. But the thing that bothered me most wasn't how they got out. It was the fact that they were able to leave without being seen by trained officers who were standing only a few feet away from their hiding spot. I didn't go down the stairs. I didn't even take a photo. I closed the door, locked it again, shoved the chair back under the handle, and walked out of the townhouse without grabbing breakfast, without grabbing my laundry, without grabbing anything I didn't absolutely need. I spent the entire day trying not to think about those prints, trying not to picture someone crouched in the dark, listening to the cops walk past them, waiting. That evening, I went home only long enough to pack my belongings into garbage bags and boxes. I didn't go near the basement. I didn't even look at the door. I called the landlord that same night and told him I was breaking the lease. I didn't argue when he told me about the early termination fee. I paid it the next morning and left Halifax a week later. I still think about that basement more often than I'd like to admit. I'll never know how that person got out of there without the officers finding them, and I don't want to know. Whatever route they took, whatever corner they used to hide, whatever moment they slipped away, I'm just glad I wasn't standing near that furnace when they decided to move. It was late in the summer of 2019 when I was living alone in a small, single-story rental just outside Tyler. The neighborhood was quiet, nothing like the city, and the streets were lined with well-kept lawns and trees that cast long shadows at night. Behind my house, the property ended at a line of thick woods that stretched for what felt like miles. I had chosen the place for its peace, but I never imagined how much those woods would make me feel exposed, even in a quiet neighborhood. I had a cheap home security system installed, just the door alarms that would beep if someone opened them. I figured it was better than nothing, though I always assumed the worst that would happen would be a raccoon getting into the trash. On a Wednesday night, sometime around 1:17 a.m., I woke up to a sharp, high-pitched beeping coming from the back door. It cut through the stillness of the house, making me sit straight up in bed. For a moment, I thought it might have been the wind. The door sometimes rattled when a strong breeze blew through the trees, but the sound that followed was far more deliberate. A soft click came immediately after the alarm, the unmistakable sound of the back door shutting. Whoever it was had just come in. My stomach dropped. I froze for a second, straining my ears. Then came the slow, deliberate creak of the hallway floorboards. Heavy footsteps, not light like a cat or the usual creaks of an old house, but heavy and careful, almost methodical. They were moving toward the bedroom. My heart pounded in my chest, loud enough that I was afraid the person outside would hear it. I quietly slid off the bed and crawled into the closet, pulling the door almost shut. It wasn't a perfect hiding spot, but it was the only place where I could stay out of sight, where I could try to figure out what to do next. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911, whispering into the receiver so low I could barely hear myself. The operator's calm voice over the line was almost surreal compared to the pounding in my ears. I whispered my location and explained that someone had broken in, that I was home alone, and that the intruder was moving through the house. I could hear every word of the footsteps on the other side of the bedroom wall. Whoever it was walked as if they had been here before, moving directly toward my room without hesitation, without even pausing to check the other areas of the house. The footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, chest tight, afraid to even breathe too loudly. Then I heard it. The doorknob turned slowly once, just once. There was no rattling, no pushing, no attempt to force it open. The person simply checked if the door was locked, testing the handle carefully, like they already knew what they were doing. Every second stretched into an eternity, my heart racing with a mix of fear and disbelief. The doorknob released, and after what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away, slowly, deliberately, back toward the hallway. A minute later, the back door alarm beeped again, a soft, haunting reminder that someone had been there. I stayed in the closet for what felt like hours, shaking, listening, afraid to move until I heard the faint sounds of a police car pulling up in the driveway. When the officers came in, they found nothing. No doors forced open, no windows broken, nothing missing. But they did notice the mud tracks leading from the woods straight to the back patio. The tracks were fresh, the soil still damp and clinging to the soles of whatever boots the intruder had worn. It was clear someone had walked all the way from the woods, made their way to the house, and then vanished without a trace. It was as though they had melted back into the shadows, leaving no sign except for the mud and the faint impression of someone knowing exactly where to go. I couldn't sleep in that house again. Not for days, not for weeks. Every sound became terrifying. The wind rattling the trees, the pipes groaning, a car passing by. I started locking all the doors twice, checking windows multiple times, and even leaving lights on in every room. I avoided being alone in the house, not wanting to take any chances. Eventually, I stayed with a friend for a month, unable to return to the house. The thought of someone walking into my bedroom while I slept had shaken me more than anything else in my life, and the fact that they had been so careful, so precise, made it worse. Over time, I moved out of that rental, renting a place closer to the center of town where the woods weren't so close. I told myself it was over, that the person had either been caught elsewhere or simply moved on, but the memory never left. Every time I walk past a line of trees near my house, my chest tightens. I check every door twice, sometimes 3 times, even in the daylight. It taught me how quickly a place that feels safe can become threatening, how fragile the sense of security really is. The most terrifying part wasn't the intrusion itself, but the knowledge that the intruder had known where to go, had moved with purpose and calm, and had left nothing behind to suggest they had ever been there. That precision, that knowledge, stayed with me far longer than the alarm or the mud. It made every shadow in my new home feel a little heavier, every noise a little sharper, and it reminded me that safety is never guaranteed, even when you think it is. I eventually regained a sense of normalcy, but I changed the way I lived alone. I invested in better security systems, motion detectors, cameras. I never slept without locking everything multiple times and checking each window. I still remember the sound of the doorknob turning, slowly, deliberately, and the way the footsteps had come toward my room as if guided by some unspoken map. Even now, years later, I can replay it in my head, every sound, every movement. It is not a story of ghosts or fairy tales. It was real, and it happened to me, and it changed how I see the world, how I live in it, and how careful I have to be, because some dangers leave no trace but leave a memory that refuses to fade. The house still sits empty now, last I checked. I never went back. I don't think I could, even knowing no one was inside. The thought of those heavy footsteps coming back still makes me shiver. I learned to be cautious, to trust my instincts, and to never underestimate someone who knows your house as well as you do. The experience left a mark, a warning that safety is fragile, and sometimes, knowing you could be completely exposed is enough to keep you awake for nights that follow. I was working late one night in my townhouse in Raleigh, trying to finish a project that had been sitting on my laptop for weeks. The clock on my desk read 12:21 a.m., and the house was quiet except for the soft hum of my computer and the occasional creak from the floors as the house settled. I had just poured myself a cup of lukewarm coffee and was leaning back in my chair, rubbing my eyes when my phone buzzed. The motion alerts from the driveway camera had started popping up, one frame at a time, low light, grainy, almost nothing but dark shapes and flickers. At first, I thought it was a raccoon or some stray cat wandering around, maybe digging through the trash bins, but something about the images made my stomach tighten. I grabbed my laptop and opened the live feed. My heart dropped. There was a man standing in my driveway. He was wearing a dark hoodie pulled tightly over his head, the hood casting a shadow over his face. He wasn't moving. Not a twitch, not a step, just standing there staring directly at the house. For almost 5 minutes, he didn't do anything, just lingered in that same spot like he was frozen, watching, waiting. I could see the outline of his shoulders, the slight bend in his knees as he shifted weight from one foot to the other. My hands were shaking, and I felt a cold sweat start at my neck, running down my back. Then, slowly, he lifted something. It was a phone. He held it up in front of his chest and started panning it, moving it side to side slowly, capturing the front of my house, the windows, the porch, everything. I felt sick. Every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. I pressed my phone against my chest and tried to stay calm. My mind was racing with scenarios. What if he knew I was alone? What if he had done this before? What if he wasn't planning on leaving? I could hear my own breathing, loud and uneven in the quiet of the house, and it felt like the walls were closing in. I turned off all the lights, hoping that the darkness would make him lose interest or not see any movement inside. I dropped down to the floor, crawling toward the hallway where I had a small security panel and a phone charging. The feed showed him moving again, walking slowly toward the side of the house. My phone buzzed with another motion alert. He was circling, just keeping his phone up, moving slowly, deliberately, like he was studying the layout. Every time he stepped into frame, I froze, holding my breath, willing him not to notice any light from the windows or movement inside. Minutes dragged on. Each alert made my stomach twist. My mind kept jumping ahead, imagining him finding a way to get in. I checked the locks in my head, deadbolts, chain locks, sliding locks, all secure. But security measures suddenly felt meaningless. He could wait. He could come back. The fear was thick in the air, clinging to my skin like a wet blanket. Then the worst happened. The final motion alert came. My screen lit up, and there he was again, standing right at the front door. My throat went dry. He pressed his ear to the door and tilted his head slightly, like he was listening. I stayed as low as I could, too scared to move. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything, but fear had me frozen. My fingers fumbled over my phone, calling the police. Every second waiting for them felt like an eternity. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. They searched the area, checking the streets, the alleys, the shadows behind nearby trees and cars. Nothing. No trace, no footprints, no sign of anyone. Just empty streets and my pounding heart. They reassured me that they would increase patrols in the neighborhood and asked me to stay alert, but I knew it wasn't enough. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like the safety of my home had been stripped away in a single night. The next day, I didn't sleep much. I kept checking the driveway, double checking locks, and even walking around the perimeter to see if anything had been left behind. I was on edge. Then 2 days later, my neighbor across the street knocked on my door. She looked shaken, holding a small folded note. She had found it tucked under her welcome mat. Inside was a blurry printed photo of her house at night, obviously taken from outside, just like the one I had seen the intruder holding. I felt my stomach sink. Whoever had been watching my house wasn't just a random trespasser. They were organized, deliberate, and had clearly been observing the neighborhood for some time. After that, I didn't take any chances. I bought heavier curtains, blackout ones that would completely obscure any view into the house. I rearranged my parking so that my car wasn't immediately visible from the street. I even started varying my routines, taking different routes when I came home, leaving lights on timers, anything that might make the house seem less predictable. I also invested in a more reliable security system with cameras that covered all angles and allowed real-time monitoring with clearer images. It took weeks before I felt somewhat normal again. The sense of being watched lingered, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I stayed vigilant, checking every knock, every sound, every shadow, and while the intruder never returned, I knew it wasn't because they had lost interest. I just wasn't going to make it easy for them anymore. Every night, before going to bed, I double-checked the locks, the cameras, the driveway, and my surroundings. It became a habit, a routine born from fear, and it gave me a small sense of control over a situation that had once felt completely helpless. Eventually, I started to feel safer. The tension in my chest eased, but I never let it go completely. I knew the reality: someone had been watching my home, had mapped the windows and doors, had taken photographs. That knowledge stayed with me, a reminder of how fragile the sense of safety in your own home can be. I could still work late at night, still enjoy quiet evenings, but always with a new caution. I didn't feel Navi anymore. I didn't feel invincible. I had learned that the real terror isn't some ghost or monster. It's a person, real and deliberate, who can invade your life with a single moment of courage or recklessness. After several months, I started to feel almost normal again, but the routine stuck. The heavier curtains, the varied parking, the constant awareness, these were permanent changes. I would never take the safety of my home for granted again. And while life moved forward, the memory of that night stayed with me, a sharp, unrelenting reminder of how close things can get to slipping out of control, even in a quiet neighborhood in Raleigh. In the winter of 2020, I was living alone in a small apartment in Billings. The kind of winter that gets into your bones, with snow piled high against the windows and a wind that made the streets feel empty and harsh even at night. That evening, I came home from work around 9:34 p.m. The roads slick with ice, my car crusted with frozen salt and snow. I was tired in a way that made my body feel like it was made of lead. I fumbled with my keys in the cold, finally sliding the door open and stepping into the warmth of my place. The lights were dim because I hadn't bothered turning on anything beyond the kitchen light. Everything smelled faintly like the heating oil from the radiator, mixed with the faint lingering smell of last night's dinner. I kicked off my boots, leaving wet imprints on the linoleum, and hung my coat in the small entryway closet. The thought of standing under a hot shower for the next 20 minutes sounded like the only relief I could imagine. I didn't even bother taking off my clothes carefully. I just stripped down and stepped into the bathroom, letting the warmth of the room hit my cold skin. That's when I noticed the shower curtain wasn't how I remembered it. Usually, I pushed it back all the way to prevent mildew from growing. But tonight, it was pulled almost all the way across the tub, leaving just a small slit. Not enough for someone to get in, I told myself, but enough to feel off. Like someone had been peeking through and then let go, leaving the curtain to hang in that wrong position. I shook my head, trying to convince myself I had just been careless earlier. I brushed it off, assuming I might have nudged it with my elbow when getting out the last time. I turned on the water, hot steam filling the small bathroom almost instantly. The mirror fogged over, and the smell of soap and shampoo mixed with the damp air. I closed my eyes and leaned into the warmth, letting the water hit my face. For a few minutes, I felt myself start to relax, letting go of the stress of work, the endless calls, the emails, the problems I had spent all day dealing with. Then I heard it. At first, it was almost too quiet to recognize, a subtle scrape against the tile floor, like a foot shifting, maybe adjusting a sandal, only there were no sandals in my apartment. My heart started pounding, a rapid thump I could feel in my throat. My body stiffened. The curtain behind me swayed gently, not from the draft of the water, but like it had been brushed by someone's hand. My stomach tightened, my pulse hammering against my ears. I ripped the curtain back with one hand, the water still running and steaming my glasses in the mirror, but no one was there. The tub was empty. The only thing that had changed was the small window above the tub, the tiny square that let in the dim light of a snowy street outside. It was unlocked. I froze. My eyes locked on the window, mind racing. I know I had never unlocked it. Not once since I moved in months ago. The lock was stubborn, the kind that clicked firmly when it was closed. But there it was unlatched, letting a chill into the bathroom, carrying with it a smell of wet snow and something faintly metallic. I shut off the water, grabbed my towel with trembling hands, and wrapped it around myself without drying off properly. My mind was racing, every scenario worse than the last. Someone had been inside my home. Someone had walked around while I was out. I felt the weight of that in a way that made my chest tighten, my hands shake uncontrollably. I ran through the apartment, checking the doors, peeking into rooms. Every closet, every window, nothing. Nothing moved, nothing out of place beyond what I had already seen. But I knew, I just knew. The small footprints of someone who had climbed onto the windowsill and the faint smudge on the bathroom tile behind the curtain were enough to confirm it. Wet footprints, probably from snow tracked in on shoes, someone's hand leaving a dirty mark on the tile, likely from pushing the curtain aside. They had been here, and they hadn't left until I got home. I called the police from my car in the driveway, shivering despite the heater blasting full. I couldn't go back inside, not yet. I wrapped myself in my coat, shoes still wet, and sat with the car running, watching the glow of the apartment through the frosted windows. Every sound, the wind, the distant howl of a stray dog, the creak of the building settling, made me flinch. When the officers arrived, they went through every inch of the apartment, carefully dusting for prints and checking doors and windows. They confirmed what I had already suspected. The window had been opened from the outside. Someone had climbed in, touched the tiles in the bathroom, and left faint footprints around the apartment. There was no sign of theft. Nothing missing. It didn't matter. The violation was in itself enough to make my skin crawl, to make the idea of being alone inside these walls unbearable. I stayed at a friend's place that night, unable to go back into my apartment. I slept in the living room with the lights on, the curtains pulled tight, my phone in my hand the entire time. The next day, I changed all the locks, including the stubborn bathroom window. I added extra locks to the door, a metal bar across the back window, and installed a more advanced security system with cameras I could monitor from my phone. I learned to notice every sound, every shadow, every small shift in the house. I became meticulous about locking everything, even if I stepped out for just a minute. The scariest part wasn't just that someone had been inside. It was the knowledge that I had been so close, that I had walked into the apartment and into the shower while they were there, or had just left minutes before they moved. It could have been different if they had stayed longer, if they had waited for me to be more vulnerable. That knowledge lingered. Every winter after that, every time I stepped into that apartment, every time I felt the cold draft from a window, I remembered that night. Eventually, I moved out of that apartment. I found a place with fewer windows on a higher floor, and I didn't take any chances. The experience stayed with me, but over time, it became a story I could tell without feeling the panic rise all over again. I knew what I had learned from it. You can't assume your space is safe just because it feels familiar. You can't assume that locks are enough. And sometimes, the smallest details, a curtain slightly out of place, a window left unlocked, can be the difference between feeling secure and knowing just how vulnerable you really are. That winter in Billings left its mark. It made me cautious, yes, but it also gave me a certain clarity. I became aware of the things I had ignored before, the ways someone could exploit even the smallest oversight. I made sure I never overlooked those things again. And even though the memory is uncomfortable, it's clear in my mind, and I survived it. That was the most important part. I survived. I locked the doors, I strengthened the apartment, and I never let that same vulnerability happen again. I never forgot how close it had been, and I made sure my home was never so easy to breach again. I came home from work on a late November evening. The sky was a dull gray, and the wind rattled the bare branches of the trees lining the street. It was around 4:58 p.m. when I pulled into my driveway. I had been looking forward to a quiet evening alone after a long day at the office. The house felt unusually silent as I stepped inside, the soft click of the door closing behind me echoing in the empty rooms. I hung up my coat and went to the hallway to put my bag down, and that's when I noticed something that immediately made my stomach tighten. The attic hatch in the ceiling, a simple square wooden panel I hadn't opened since I moved in, was slightly ajar. My first thought was that I must have left it that way when I had brought boxes up during the move. But no, I was certain it had been fully closed. The way it tilted at an odd angle suggested that someone had been up there, and I froze for a long moment, staring at it. The house was quiet, too quiet. My hands felt clammy as I moved a chair under the hatch and carefully climbed up. My phone was in my hand, its light casting a thin, trembling beam across the wooden beams above me. I pressed my face just above the opening and peered inside. The sight made me step back, my stomach twisting. There was a sleeping bag folded neatly against the far wall, a half-empty Gatorade bottle on the floor, and a fast food bag that definitely wasn't mine, its crumpled contents still inside. Someone had been living in my attic without my knowledge. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest, the fear settling in like a weight that pressed down on my lungs. I climbed down slowly, my movements careful and deliberate, trying not to make any sudden noise that might announce my presence. I grabbed my phone and stepped outside onto the front steps. The wind had picked up, cold and sharp, and I could hear the low groan of the trees as the branches banged against one another. I dialed the police, my voice unsteady as I reported what I had found. Every step I took on the front porch felt heavy, and I kept imagining the person upstairs, realizing that I had discovered them. My mind raced with questions and terrifying possibilities. Had they been watching me? Had they come down while I was at work? How long had this been going on? When the officers arrived, they moved quietly inside, one of them holding a flashlight that sliced through the dim hallway light. I stayed outside, pacing, trying not to make any sound that would carry back into the house. Minutes felt like hours. Then they came back out, one of them holding a small notebook. My heart sank as he handed it to me. The notebook was small, worn at the edges, the cover bent and soft from handling. Inside, the pages were filled with neat handwriting. Notes about me, my schedule, when I left for work, when I returned, which lights I turned off, when I showered, when I went to sleep. Every mundane action had been recorded in painstaking detail. Page after page, it was all there. The last entry was from the day before, written in the same careful hand. Friday. Stayed quiet while she ate dinner. She sits in the living room from 8:15 to 10:00. Lights out by 10:20. Doesn't lock the window by the sink. I sat on the steps, gripping the notebook, feeling the cold seep through my coat. The thought that someone had been watching me this closely, following my routine, recording everything, made my chest tighten. I kept imagining them moving silently through the attic while I was at work, or even worse, while I was asleep. I spent the next hour packing what I could into boxes and bags. The house that had once felt safe now felt suffocating, the air thick with the presence of someone who had no right to be there. I checked every window, every lock, even the basement door. I wanted to believe that locking the doors would make a difference, that it would somehow erase the knowledge that someone had been inside. But it didn't. I could still feel the weight of their gaze, their quiet observation, lingering in the corners of every room. By the next morning, I had contacted a moving company and arranged for a new place. I drove through the neighborhood one last time, the streets empty, the early winter sun casting long shadows across the pavement. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bark of a dog made me tense, as if I expected someone to step out from behind a tree or a fence and follow me. At the new apartment, I checked every lock, every latch, every window. I even installed a small security camera inside the living room, the kind that I could monitor from my phone. I didn't sleep well for weeks, constantly waking at the slightest sound, imagining the notebook in the wrong hands, imagining footsteps on the ceiling above me. The old house faded into the background over time, but the fear never fully left. Eventually, I felt safe enough to go about my daily life. I still took precautions, locking every door and window, never leaving anything unattended. I became hyper aware of my surroundings, a habit born from the knowledge that someone had been so close, so silent for so long. I learned to accept that the world was not always as private or safe as I had assumed, and that vigilance was necessary, even in the quietest of neighborhoods. The notebook remained in the police evidence room, and I never saw it again. I later heard from the officers that they found no further signs of the person living there, and there were no fingerprints or DNA that could identify them. It was as if they had vanished into thin air the moment the police arrived, leaving only the notebook and the memory of their presence. I moved forward, but I never forgot that feeling of being watched, the weight of knowing that someone had been in my home, living above me without my knowledge. It changed the way I lived, made me more cautious, more alert. And though I had a new home, a fresh start, the fear that had settled in that November evening never fully disappeared. I would never again feel completely alone in my own space, never again underestimate the quiet dangers that can hide in the most familiar of places. I was 23, living alone in a small rental townhouse on the east side of Halifax. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly families and a few older couples who had lived there for decades. My place was nothing fancy: 2 stories, a tiny basement, and a small backyard fenced in with weathered wood. I liked it because it was mine, even if I didn't own it. I had moved in about 6 months earlier, and for the most part, things had been normal. There was one small quirk, though, that I had learned to live with: the basement light. It had always been finicky. Sometimes it flickered for no reason, especially when the washing machine ran, which was usually late at night, when I tried to do laundry quietly after work. I had never thought much about it beyond, I'll need to replace the bulb one day, until that Wednesday night. It was late November. The rain had started earlier in the evening, drumming softly against the windows and the roof, and the wind picked up in sharp gusts that rattled the shutters. I had just gotten home from work, tired, but determined to get my laundry done. I made a mug of coffee and carried my basket down to the basement, the smell of wet pavement and the faint scent of coffee mixing in the humid, cold air that seeped in through the old windows. I dropped the laundry into the machine and started it, leaning back against the wall as the soft whir of the washer began. The basement light flickered almost immediately, and I muttered to myself, pulling my sweater tighter around me. It was normal, I told myself, nothing more. I had lived here long enough to accept the flickering bulbs, the odd squeak of the floorboards, and the creaks the house made as it settled in the cold nights. Then, at precisely 10:03 p.m., the light went out completely. 1 second it was flickering, the next second, nothing. I was staring at the darkness for a beat, thinking maybe the bulb had finally given out. I reached for my phone to use the flashlight. The basement smelled a little musty, damp, and cold. I pressed the button, and a narrow beam of light stretched across the floor, illuminating the washing machine, the dryer, the shelves stacked with detergent, and the cobwebs in the corners. My hand shook slightly as I tried to focus the light. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. I wasn't alone. It wasn't a noise that made me realize it. There wasn't a footstep, a creak, or anything that I could immediately identify. It was the breathing. Slow, deliberate, coming from the far corner of the basement near the wall, where the shadows clung. My heart slammed in my chest so hard I could almost feel it in my throat. I froze. My mind raced, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or the old house settling. I told myself that logically, no one could be down here. I lived alone. My neighbors wouldn't be wandering in at night. And yet, the breathing was real. It was there, steady, controlled, patient. It wasn't human, like in a polite sense. It was heavy, calm, and purposeful. Someone was watching me. I wanted to run, but the stairs were behind me, and every instinct screamed at me not to turn my back to whatever it was. My hands fumbled, shaking as I tried to dial 911. My phone felt slippery from my sweat, even though the basement was cold. I pointed the flashlight around, trying to catch a glimpse of movement. That's when I saw it, a shadow, hunched near the washing machine. It didn't move much, just crouched low watching me. I could make out the shape of a person, but it was so dark I couldn't tell anything else. No face, no details, just the presence of someone who had been hiding in my house. My stomach dropped. My mind screamed at me to stay calm, to think, to do something, but every rational thought felt buried under raw fear. I grabbed the nearest object I could find, a laundry basket still half, full of wet clothes, and hurled it toward the shape. The basket slammed into them with a muffled crash, scattering laundry across the floor. The shape recoiled, a sudden sharp movement that made my heart leap into my throat. That was all I needed. I bolted, up the stairs, 2 at a time, my sneakers slipping slightly on the old wooden steps, my lungs burning from adrenaline. I slammed the basement door behind me and turned the lock, my hands trembling so badly I could barely twist it. I backed away from the door, my chest heaving, listening for any sound from below. The breathing had stopped. Silence filled the basement. Only the soft patter of rain against the windows remained. I stayed in the living room for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes, sitting with my phone pressed to my chest, checking that the lock held. I called the landlord first thing the next morning, my voice barely above a whisper, recounting every detail I could remember. They promised to come over immediately. By the time they arrived, the sun was just starting to cut through the heavy clouds, casting pale light across the living room. The landlord, a middle-aged man who had been managing the property for over 20 years, didn't look shocked when I told him everything. He nodded, grabbed a flashlight, and followed me down to the basement. The scene was unsettling. The basement looked untouched at first glance, but the landlord pointed out something that made my stomach drop. Dust on the stairs. Footprints, fresh, leading from the bottom of the steps to the far corner. They were small, careful, deliberate. Someone had been moving around down there. He went on to point out a small crawl space under the stairs, barely noticeable, its panel loose. Dust on the panel suggested it had been opened recently, and there were faint scuff marks along the edge. On the washing machine, there were fingerprints smeared across the metal surface, the kind you couldn't see without shining a light at the right angle. The landlord muttered under his breath, more to himself than to me, that whoever had been there had clearly been hiding for some time, possibly weeks. The thought made my skin crawl. Someone had been living in my house without my knowledge, sleeping, moving, breathing, all while I went about my life upstairs. I left the house that day to stay with a friend, unable to face being alone there. The landlord called the police, who came to investigate, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of anyone. No stolen items, no trace beyond the crawl space and footprints. The officer explained that people sometimes broke into houses and stayed in hidden spaces, but they usually left before anything happened. That didn't make me feel any better. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even now, Whenever I hear a flicker in the basement light or a soft creak from below, I feel that same cold fear creeping up my spine. I started checking every door and window at night, locking everything twice, and even installed an extra deadbolt on the basement door. I refused to go down there alone, not even to get laundry. I moved my washing machine to a laundromat for months. I changed my routines, never leaving the door open for delivery people without supervision, never leaving the house alone at night without checking every possible entry. Over time, the fear lessened slightly, but it never fully went away. The memory of that slow, deliberate breathing, the shape crouched in the dark, lingered in my mind. It changed the way I saw my home, my safety, my solitude. I realized how fragile the illusion of security could be, how easy it was for someone to slip into your life unnoticed. I could never fully relax in that townhouse again, but I made it work. I started going to bed earlier, keeping lights on, leaving radios playing softly in the background, so I didn't feel that oppressive silence. I eventually stopped seeing the shadow in my mind's eye, but the instinct to check the locks, the fear of the basement, the way I froze at every sound, it never really left me. That townhouse still stands today, a quiet building among many on a Halifax street. I never went back alone. When I finally moved out, I told the new tenants very little, just a warning about the basement light and the old crawl space under the stairs. I didn't go into details, not wanting to frighten them unnecessarily, but I made sure they knew, always check, always lock, always be aware. And even now, years later, whenever I pass by a house with a flickering basement light or a dark corner in the distance, I feel it. That creeping, inescapable awareness that someone could be there, watching, waiting unseen. And it terrifies me more than I ever thought anything could. It was late November, and I had just gotten home from work around 4:58 p.m. The sky was already a deep shade of orange, with the sun sinking low behind the trees outside my living room window. The long, slanted shadows stretched across the floor, casting an eerie pattern over the furniture, making everything look a little sharper and stranger than it normally did. The house felt colder than usual, and I could feel the chill creeping in from the gaps around the windows. I tossed my bag on the couch, and the soft thud echoed louder than it should have in the quiet house. I immediately noticed something that made my stomach twist. The attic hatch in the hallway was slightly open. One of those square wooden panels set flush into the ceiling, the kind you barely notice until something is off. At first, I froze for a moment, staring at it. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had left it open the last time I went up there. Maybe it had shifted on its own. But no, I knew I hadn't touched it. I was sure. A small knot of panic tightened in my chest. My pulse started racing. I could feel it in my ears, a soft, thudding echo of fear. I grabbed the nearest chair, a simple wooden one I usually kept in the corner of the hallway, and placed it carefully under the hatch. My hands shook slightly as I climbed onto it. My phone was in my pocket, and I flicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dim hallway light and onto the ceiling panel. I pulled the hatch open cautiously, every creak of the hinges making me flinch. Inside, the attic was dark and smelled faintly of dust, and something else I couldn't place at first. The beam of my phone light revealed a sleeping bag spread out in a corner. Next to it was an empty Gatorade bottle, and crumpled nearby was a fast food bag. Grease stains dark and visible even in the low light. None of it belonged to me. My stomach dropped, my hands gripping the phone tighter. Someone had been living in my attic. For how long, I couldn't tell. Days, maybe even longer. I climbed down carefully, trying not to make a sound. Each step of the chair on the hardwood floor felt loud enough to alert someone if they were still there. My mind raced. Call 911, I thought. But even as I reached for my phone, doubt crept in. What if they were still up there? What if they heard me? What if making noise made them act? My breath caught in my throat as I realized how vulnerable I felt. The house, which always felt safe, now seemed like a trap. I tiptoed to the kitchen, grabbing the heavy cast iron skillet that always sat on the stove. Its weight was comforting in my hand, solid and real. I moved toward the middle of the kitchen, listening for any sound, any movement. Nothing. The house was silent. just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards settling. My imagination filled in every small noise as a possible intruder. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself I was imagining it, that the evidence of the sleeping bag and bottles could be from someone who had already left. But then I heard it, a faint scrape from above, a brush of something soft against wood. My stomach sank. I whispered to myself that I had to act. I called 911 quietly, explaining the situation in the softest voice I could manage. The dispatcher told me to leave the house if I could and wait outside for the police. I edged toward the front door, my hand on the doorknob, my other hand gripping the skillet. I paused, straining my ears. The scrape came again, louder this time, and then a dull thump, like someone stepping on the floor above me. My heart jumped, and I froze. Another thump followed, closer, and the attic hatch swung open fully. A man's head appeared, looking down at me. His eyes were wide, wild, and completely unblinking. He froze when he saw me, and for a moment, everything slowed. My mind screamed to run, but my body was rooted in place. Then instinct took over. I screamed and swung the skillet with every ounce of strength I had. He recoiled and then bolted. I didn't wait. I ran. Down the front steps and into the street, the cold night air hitting my face. My breath came in sharp gasps, and I kept looking back at the house, expecting him to follow. The street was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I stayed there, shivering, gripping my phone, waiting for the police to arrive. When they came, the investigation confirmed the worst. The man had been living in my attic for days. There were signs of him moving quietly through the house, touching things, rearranging items. He hadn't stolen much, but small things were missing: extra socks from my dresser, snacks from the pantry. In their place were odd items: a tiny notebook with his name, old photographs, and a small pocket knife. The police told me he had probably been watching me, learning my routines. The thought made my stomach churn. I stayed with a neighbor that night, unable to go back inside. The house felt wrong, tainted by the presence that had hidden above me for so long. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been there, breathing the same air, maybe even looking down on me as I moved through my own home. I went back only once the next day to pack a few essentials. Every step felt heavy, and the stairs to the attic loomed in my mind like a warning. The next week, I moved. I found a small apartment across town, a place with no hidden corners and no attic. Every piece of furniture felt familiar and solid, the kind of things that didn't hide secrets. I double-checked every lock, every window, every hatch. I even went so far as to check the vents, imagining that anyone could crawl through them. Sleeping was difficult at first. Every noise, a gust of wind rattling the window, the fridge humming, a car door slamming outside, made me tense, ready to act. Slowly, though, the fear began to dull. I still think about that night. I still imagine the man's eyes peering down at me from above. But I also remember the skillet in my hand, the moment of clarity when fear turned into action. It's a memory that haunts, yes, but it's also a reminder of what staying alert, staying cautious, and trusting instinct can do. I learned to respect my own space in a way I never had before. My house isn't just a building, it's a sanctuary, and the violation of that sanctuary changes you. Even now, I cannot walk past an attic hatch without pausing, checking and imagining what might be lurking above. It has made me meticulous. Locks are double-check it. Doors are never left unlocked, and I sleep with a small flashlight within reach. I've read countless stories about break-ins and home invasions, and now I understand why people obsess over security. It's not paranoia, it's survival instinct, sharpened by experience. The experience also left me with a sense of gratitude I hadn't felt before, for safety, for light, for the ability to call for help. Every mundane moment now carries a weight I didn't notice before. I appreciate the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of the floorboards, the normal sounds that once bored me. They are proof of life continuing as it should, without an intruder hiding above. In my new apartment, I finally feel secure. I've installed additional locks, a security system, and extra lighting around the entrances. I no longer take my surroundings for granted. I walk through my home with my senses alert, aware of every sound and movement, ready to react. It's a strange way to live, perhaps, but it's the way I survive. The man who once hid in my attic will never return. I know that now. and yet a part of me will always check the ceiling before I go to bed. A habit I cannot shake, a memory etched deeply into my mind. The night I discovered him will always be vivid. The faint glow of my phone light illuminating the dusty attic, the sleeping bag spread out like someone had planned to stay, the empty bottle and the bag that wasn't mine. All of it is permanently imprinted in my memory, but so is the skillet in my hand, the rush of fear that turned to action, and the relief of running into the cold night, away from danger. Those images remind me of my strength, my ability to respond, and my insistence on not letting fear completely take over. I have never lived alone again without checking every corner, every hatch, every small space. I have never taken my home for granted. I have never allowed myself to forget the feeling of someone hiding above, watching, waiting. That night was terrifying in ways I could not have imagined, but it also reshaped how I live, how I move through spaces, and how I value safety. Even now, years later, the thought of an open attic hatch makes my pulse quicken. But I've learned to act to respond and to protect what is mine. The experience was a nightmare, yes, but it left me with clarity, awareness, and a profound respect for the quiet security of a home. My attic remains closed, my locks remain secured, and my life, though forever changed, continues with a sharper sense of caution and the certainty that vigilance can save you when the ordinary turns terrifying. That night, I realized that safety is never guaranteed and trust is something fragile, but I also realized that preparedness, awareness, and quick action are powerful tools. I never underestimate the value of being alert, and I never allow my guard to drop completely. The man in my attic is gone, and I am here, alive, aware, and far more cautious than I ever thought I would be. Every corner of my home, every shadow, every hatch, now carries the weight of that memory, a permanent reminder of what it means to truly be alone, and to survive it. I finally feel a sense of closure, knowing I took the right steps, acted quickly, and preserved my safety. My past home may always carry the shadow of what happened, but my present is secure. I have rebuilt my life, my routines, and my sense of safety. The fear that once gripped me so tightly has transformed into vigilance, a silent guard that never sleeps. I am alone in my home now, but I am never helpless, and that knowledge brings a peace that I could not have imagined on that November evening when I first found him hiding above me. Even the ordinary things, a quiet night, a locked door, the soft hum of appliances, carry a new depth. They are not just background noise, they are proof that I survived, that I protected myself, and that my home is truly mine. I live with that awareness every day, and though I would not wish the fear I felt on anyone, I recognize its value. It taught me to notice, to act, and to never assume safety is automatic. That lesson is etched into my bones, permanent, unshakable, and real. I check my attic hatch one last time, ensuring it is closed tightly. I secure my locks, verify my alarms, and take a deep breath. The night outside is quiet, the shadows long, but I feel in control. I know the man who once lived above me will never return, and I know I will never be caught off guard the way I was. My home is mine again, and I can finally move through it without the constant, looming fear that once consumed me. I am careful, alert, and aware, but I am safe, and that is enough. It is a vivid, terrifying memory, but it is also a complete one. I acted, I survived, and I reclaimed my life and my home. The attic is closed, the locks are secured, the skillet is back on the stove, and I am here, alive, awake, and cautious, knowing that the world is unpredictable, but my actions can protect me. I have turned fear into vigilance, panic into preparation, and terror into a lasting awareness that ensures I am never truly alone, and never truly unprotected again.